différents. Mon nom est Teddy Sami et je suis le directeur de la Norman Patterson School of International Affairs à l'Université Carleton. J'aimerais avant tout reconnaître que le campus de l'Université Carleton est situé sur le territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe, présente en ces lieux depuis des temps immémoriaux. We're delighted that you can join us today at NIPSIA's Black History Month event. As many of you know, every February, Black History Month events are held across Canada. And these events, including today's, are an opportunity to learn about the contributions that Black Canadians and their communities have made and continue to make to this country. In fact, this year's chosen theme for Black History Month in Canada is Black Excellence, a heritage to celebrate, a future to build. It is about celebrating the past and present contributions and also reflecting on future ones. Donc, au nom de NIPSIA et en mon nom personnel, je tiens à remercier nos invités distingués, Ambassadeur Anderson Blanc, qui est ambassadeur du Canada en Côte d'Ivoire et qui couvre aussi le Libéria, Madame Frédérique Delaprée, conseillère à l'ambassade du Canada en France, et ambassadeur Marc Diendéré, ambassadeur du Canada et observateur permanent auprès de l'Union africaine. The theme of today's event is Beyond Borders, Black History Month Perspectives from the Foreign Service. We look forward to hearing the reflections of our distinguished panelists as they relate to their experience in the Foreign Service. Last but certainly not least, I want to take the opportunity to thank the NIPSIA Students Association, and in particular, Mowahib Sandouale and Fawwa Jamil, who have helped us organize today's event. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank the NIPSIA administrative staff, namely Anne Morneau and Alison Fitch, for their support. So I will now yield the floor to Mowahib, who will moderate today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sami, for this introduction. I would like to introduce myself briefly before we get into things. So my name is Mowahib Hassan Douale. I am one of the two EDI representatives in NIPSIA's Student Association and one of the organizers of this event. So today I will have the pleasure of being your moderator for this event. And before we get into things, I would like to just briefly go over how the event will take place. So the first portion of the event will be me addressing questions to our panelists and interacting with them. And the last 30 minutes of the session will be dedicated to a question and answers period. So feel free to prepare tough questions for speakers. I know they will be ready to answer them greatly. And to facilitate this discussion, we will only accept questions during that period at the end to avoid any interruptions. But feel free to engage through the chat and through reaction features as well, so that you can see that you're here present with us and appreciating the event. And with that, I would like to pass it along to my colleague Fawwa for her to introduce herself and do a land acknowledgement. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone, my name is Fawwa Jamil. I'm also a co-EDI rep with Mowahib. So before we begin the program for the panel discussion, we just want to make a little land acknowledgement. So land acknowledgements are usually given at political or academic gatherings, and they're growing more common. However, there is a disturbing trend that these land acknowledgements are much more for the audience to justify or maybe soothe our racial guilt instead of the original intended purpose, which is to acknowledge and honor Indigenous peoples and the treaty agreements of Turtle Island. So we want to use this land acknowledgement as an intentional and thoughtful way to position ourselves and to provide meaningful and thankful acknowledgement to the Indigenous communities whose land we occupy. We acknowledge that we live, gather, and organize on unceded and unsurrendered territory of Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be present on this territory as we consider equity, diversity, and inclusion in international affairs. We recognize the ways in which our presence on this land represents colonialism and reproduces dispossession and violence for Indigenous communities. Those of us who are settlers must continuously commit to learn more about how we can work to uphold the conditions of the treaties and the treaties that govern this land. We stand here as allies committed to amplifying the voices of Indigenous people to fight for the prolonged justice that they deserve. I will pass it back to Mowahib. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fawwa. Before we get into things, I cannot see Ambassador Marc Diendéré. I don't know if he's in the room with us. If you're here, turn on your camera. In the meantime, I'll start with the introductions to get us started. So first off, I would like to introduce Ambassador Anderson Blanc. He holds a BA in Business Administration from Université du Québec à Montréal from 2002 and a Master's in Business Administration, from Laval University. He previously worked in delinquency intervention before joining the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 2003. At headquarters, he served as senior advisor and acting deputy director in the Haiti and Dominican Republic Division in Policy and Trade, as well as the regional offices and Intergovernmental Relations Division in Policy and Trade. More recently, he was the deputy director of the Anti-Racism Secretariat, which reports directly to the Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. Overseas, he has served as second secretary and trade commissioner in Thailand. Most recently, he was the commercial counselor and senior regional trade commissioner in Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Mali, and Senegal. Ambassador Anderson Blanc has been appointed to Côte d'Ivoire and Liberia since 2022 and still serves this role. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador Blanc. Moving on, we have Counsellor Frédérique Delaprée, who has the pleasure of joining us for this panel. Frédérique Delaprée is the Counsellor in Economic Affairs at the Embassy of Canada to France. Prior to her current position, she worked on investment-related files and acted as lead negotiator for several of Canada's foreign investment promotion and protection agreements and the Investment Trade Policy Division at Global Affairs Canada, headquarters in Ottawa. She has also had postings abroad as First Secretary, specializing in intellectual property at the Permanent Mission of Canada to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, and Second Secretary for Trade Policy at the Embassy of Canada to the United States in Washington, D.C. At Global Affairs Canada headquarters, she has worked on bilateral and regional trade policy negotiations, as well as a number of multilateral intellectual property negotiations at the World Intellectual Property Organization and the WTO. Before joining the Foreign Service, Frédérique worked at the Canadian Department of Industry and in a private law firm. She holds a BA in History from McGill University and an LB from Queen's University and is a member of the Law Society of Ontario. Finally, I'll still read Marc Diendéré's introduction in case he joins us later. So the last speaker that we had for today is Marc Diendéré, who served as Via Rail Canada's Chief Public and Communications Officer from 2020 to 2022, where he oversaw strategic direction, communications, and stakeholder relations. His career spans the public and private sectors, including roles at Solio Cooperative Group and Québecor Media. Mr. Diendéré has a graduate degree from HEC Montréal, a master's degree in marketing management from Paris Panthéon-Assas University's French Press Institute, and a master's degree in the sociology of information and communication from the University of Ouagadougou. Actively involved in his community, he chairs UNICEF Canada and boards in arts, culture, economic development, and diversity and inclusion. Highly involved in his community, Mr. Diendéré has sat on the boards of directors of a dozen organizations working in a variety of sectors such as arts and culture, economic development, and diversity and inclusion. Ambassador Diendéré now serves as the permanent observer to the African Union since 2022. If we can please welcome our speakers for this event, I think it will be a great discussion that will be ongoing now. And so with that, I would like to get into the heat of things and start with the first question that I have for our speakers, which is considering the Foreign Service's known challenges, particularly in terms of accessibility for Black Canadians, how have you personally overcome barriers to entry and advancement in your own diplomatic careers? Feel free to go in the order that you want to answer the question.
I'm happy to defer to the ambassador.
Donc, je commence.
Oui, allez-y. Merci.
Bonjour, Frédérique. Bonjour, Sarah. I know I have a few colleagues listening on the line as well, so I'll make sure I don't say anything too weird. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate that. It's a great opportunity to share some of the few things I've learned along the way the past 20 years that I've been in the Foreign Service. That's a great question. The fact of the matter is, everything starts with believing in yourself, right? You need to build that confidence, but I believe self-confidence is based on success, but also on having the right skills. Because like I tell my sons, you're living in La La Land if you believe you can accomplish anything. You need to get the training and everything else that comes with it, sacrifices and discipline and hard work, obviously. So you need to know at the onset what skills, competencies you need to succeed. And then you need to develop those skills and competencies. If you talk about like Canadians in terms of accessibilities, especially as a diplomat, you need to know and recognize the barriers that exist and how they affect you, because I can refer you to a recent study a year or two ago from the Federal Public Service Commission, where they provided specific details about the type of barriers that racialized groups and other identified groups, so women and people with a handicap, indigenous peoples, Black people face in the public service as a whole, but also in the foreign service more specifically. So you need to recognize along this way your intersectionality, and it's really an important term, because we are who we are, and we are being seen by others, not only for who we are, but through stereotypes, right? And when you think about that, I give this example of Human for D1, people are like, what are you talking about? And it's easier to portray if you're in a country where you're not necessarily the majority, compared to when I worked in Ghana. It's different, the feeling, the way you feel, but also if you go back to intersectionality, the way people see you, if you're a woman, if you're wearing the hijab, or if you have a handicap, all these are part of your personality, right? And because of that, there are different forms of discrimination and privilege, though often that intersect and create unique challenges for people with multiple identities. So it's been said that the more identities you have, depending on your background, the more barriers that you might end up facing. And you need to understand these barriers. So we have some type of homework to do on ourselves to get to know ourselves, but to also understand what type of barriers we may end up facing. Finally, I believe that you need to surround yourself well. You need to build and be part of different networks. And this is so important. You need to be part of groups. You know, we talk about sometimes safe space, brave spaces, where you can feel safe and talk about the issues that you're going through based on your intersectionality. But you need these type of networks and mentors as well, people that will help you face these barriers. You have to keep in mind that you are not alone. And if you are not alone, there's, as the saying goes, there's strength in numbers, right? But also there's strength in better understanding the others. And there's also a key element that I cannot forget is allyship. Not only you're not alone, but there are a fair number of people out there looking at supporting us, supporting one another. I recall the call to action from the clerk back in the days and how it shaped up the federal public service as a whole, but also including my department. So there are a lot of people with great intentions. We need to do our own homework. And in addition to that, we need to educate ourselves, and sometimes we need to help others educate themselves. But at the end of the day, to overcome these barriers and to be able to advance, you need first and foremost to understand what are you facing, what type of barriers, who you are, how you can face them with others together and develop some form of strategies. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for your words, specifically on intersectionality and the importance of allyship and also knowing your own positionality. I think that's something very important for this conversation. I'd like to give Mrs. Delaprée the opportunity to speak on this question as well. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here to speak to you and the group. I'm going to echo a lot of things Ambassador Blanc said, because I think there's a lot of shared experiences that we have faced there. But I'm going to look at two aspects of the question. One, you talk about the barriers, and I like that the question takes for granted that these barriers exist. But I'm going to say that I think for a long time, it's something that I felt intrinsically, and when I spoke to other Black employees or other BIPOC employees, to say, okay, this seems really hard and strange, and I don't see anybody that looks like me that's an ambassador, and I feel like it's really hard to get in and it's really hard to move up, but it can feel very anecdotal or very much linked to your experience, and that I'm really glad that the ambassador raised the audit by the public service that was done in 2021, and that spoke specifically to the experience of Black employees, because that's something that can kind of get lost in the broader discussion, and said, Black on white, the Public Service Commission recognizes that this is a real problem. And I can't describe how, because it can be crazy making in a way that you see this thing and yet there's no, unless there's like evidence, then it's just a feeling, and to see it really concretely represented and said, no, there's a problem. That was really, I think, a big step for me in kind of recognizing these barriers are not just anecdotal situations or a feeling. And I think, when you talk about intersectionality, I think as women, as people of color, sometimes we can like doubt ourselves and say, well, maybe it's me, and I think that's very helpful to say, like, there's a problem. This is not in your head. These barriers exist. In terms of how to overcome those barriers, I'm going to echo a lot of what the ambassador says as well. I mean, GAC is a very relationship-based workplace. And so I would say once you're in, it's important to build those relationships. Absolutely mentorship, but it can be relationships with your peers. Something that I'm discovering now that I'm getting a little bit older is also I'm the mentor and I'm the person that somebody will come and talk to and look for advice for. But I think that that's important too, because you're not just looking out for yourself, you're looking out for the organization as a whole. I think representation is huge as well. When I started, there wasn't someone like Ambassador Blanc, there wasn't someone like Ambassador Theodore in Geneva or Ambassador Williams in Costa Rica. And it's been shocking to me to see how my own vision of myself and what's possible in my career has changed by seeing people reach those levels. And so I think continuing alongside that road of representation is really important. I think also that you have to recognize that maybe the department isn't always going to help you, and you have to help yourself. And one of the ways you can do that is to join the networks that the ambassador spoke about. I have done a lot of work in trade policy. I was part of the Visible Minorities Committee in trade policy, and we created a document on how to encourage diversity in hiring processes for directors, because that's what we wanted. We're like, okay, well, we have to create it for ourselves. And there's plenty of people in the department who are doing that and helping themselves out. And, from a grassroots level, kind of helping to overcome those barriers. And then I would say, for those of you that are interested in joining the department, I know it can seem very hard to break in and crack into, and I would say that can be true. But one of the things I would say to all of you is that there are so many opportunities now, and I encourage you to take advantage of them. Of course, there's a traditional Foreign Service exam, but you can come in as a non-rotational officer. I work in a big embassy here in Paris. There are so many departments that are active and present here. And so I would encourage people to kind of be creative about how to launch their careers and think broadly about the opportunities that are open to them. And you can usually, I think, find your way once you're in. So those would be my key points.
Thank you so much for your input. And I think the point that you mentioned about creating those opportunities and creating those groups themselves is very powerful, because I think sometimes, well, for myself, I can be a little fatalistic, thinking, oh, there's no group of visible minorities in that space, so I don't see the representation, so I won't do anything about it. But it's very interesting to hear that you have been able to gather around and create that safe space for yourselves at GAC. So thank you very much. And with that, we also have Ambassador Marc Diendéré who joined us. If you feel comfortable answering the first question, it was about how you overcame barriers to entry and advancement in your diplomatic career. Thank you.
So, good evening, everybody. I'm from So I'm talking to you from Addis Ababa right now.
Thank you so much for joining us at that time.
Yeah. So sorry for the delay in the internet right now. And for the full disclosure, I'm in Addis Ababa, and we may lose power here, and you may lose me also on this conversation. But right now, we're good to talk. So all protocol observed. Ambassadors Blanc and Frédérique, nice to see you. And good evening, everybody. It's late here in Addis Ababa, but I'm very glad to have this conversation with you, at least for the few moments. How do I overcome this? I'm coming from the private sector. So this is my first position. This is my first assignment as a diplomat. And let me tell you a small story. When I arrived here in September, the other ambassador, Ambassador Taba, was already on the city, and the day he wanted to introduce me, there was a celebration here in Ethiopia with all these orphans, and they trying to celebrate with us a mezcal, which is a good celebration there. And guess what? I introduced myself as an ambassador, and all these Black kids in the room, the young guys and girls are looking at me like, are you a real ambassador? I say, yes. So you still have to talk about representation, right? And I echo what Frédérique and Anderson was talking about. Representation is everything. So coming from private sector, diversity, inclusion has been a discussion. How to get from being a director to vice president and senior vice president, and then an exec, you know. But you still have to find your mentors. Find someone who can just get you through the system. Find yourself a comfort place by yourself, the one you can defend, not waking up every morning and asking people to define you. So I was a Black guy coming from Burkina Faso, living in Montreal. Look at my English now. It's French behind it. So you have to overcome a lot of stuff in your life. Just define whatever you want to project and stick with it. You cannot change this. Being Black is normal. So my thing was to get in the room and make people feel comfortable. I don't want to be in the room and people are guessing who I am and who I'm not and trying to figure out something. I'm a professional and I'm going to play the professional card. It played well for me. I didn't do no lobby to be a diplomat right now. I just received a call. Maybe because I was behaving like a good guy outside, pretending to be Anderson Blanc, and they say, okay, he can be a diplomat like Anderson, and they call me. But trust yourself. You cannot change this thing. It is good to be you, and just find your comfort place and stick with it. And even today, I was in one of those meetings at the AU. You still have to let the security people know that you're a Canadian ambassador. They're waiting for someone white. And it's not because you're in Canada that you're suffering on this thing. You're gonna, somewhere, someone is gonna dismiss you. Just relax, trust yourself, choose the part of you want to project and keep it as your strength and move on. So It's not easy. I know it's not easy. Yet there is a day where you just want to be you, Ben Marc, not Ben Marc, the black guy, or not Ben Marc, something else. But trust yourself and make sure that the thing you want to project, people can just rely on, and keep your smile. I'm sorry, we're too serious. Just smile. It's your best accessory. Before starting to converse with, have a conversation with someone, just project the comfort of yourself there and have the discussion. I must stop here because I'm too passionate about this diversity thing. I'm 52 today and I'm still talking about it. I work a lot on this field, and I can be talking on this for 1 hour. And because of the power shortage here, I don't want to be caught, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Diendéré. I don't think you can ever be too passionate, but it was really, really interesting to hear your point about using your identity sort of as your strength. And I think that holds a lot of power. So thank you very much for that. With that, I'd like to move on to new questions that I had for every single one of you. And I would start maybe with Mrs. Delaprée, if you're comfortable. I want to dive in more into your experience as a negotiator, specifically as a lead negotiator in investment-related files and foreign investment promotion. I've heard myself that sometimes negotiations are often perceived as a little less inclusive for women and minorities, and I could assume as well for Afro-descendants. I was wondering, what strategies do you employ to address those challenges and actively foster the inclusion of underrepresented voices in negotiation processes?
Well, thanks. That's a really good question, and Ambassador Diendéré mentioning, coming into a room and people not necessarily recognizing his role or maybe who he represents, and that's an experience that I've had a number of times in negotiations, walking in and I'm the lead and people will be like, oh, and you are, or they'll shake hands with the person who's assisting me, and I'm like, no, I'm the lead, hi, it's nice to meet you. And so but that actually comes back to my first point, which is that I think literally just by being the negotiator and being the person in the room, being the person who's drafting the instructions and coming up with the approach, that you are bringing the interests of the groups that you have within you to the table. I have no ability to look at the world through another lens than the lens of a Black woman. Like, I can be very empathetic and imagine the position of people around the world, but I am always going to look at the world through that lens. And all of the work that I do, and when I'm at the negotiating table, when I'm thinking about what I want to put forward, it's going to come through that lens. And so I think the first step in kind of incorporating those perspectives is, again, representation, is to have people at the table participating in the discussions who can bring in not just my perspective, but a true representation of what Canadian interests are. And that's a very broad perspective. It's not one type of person. And so there's that personal aspect. I think there's also a second aspect, which is something that's much more codified now and that we're talking about much more, which is using frameworks and really formally looking at our work through specific lenses. So in the Government of Canada, we work a lot with what's called the GBA plus lens, which requires you to look at not just gender-based issues, but also issues related to other marginalized groups, and to formally integrate those perspectives into a negotiating document. And so when I go to my boss with my instructions, I can't just hand in my instructions and say, like, okay, well, this is what I think represents Canada's position. I need to fill out a form, and I need to say exactly how I think this is going to affect various groups, or how it may affect various underrepresented groups. So for example, in trade policy, if I know that something that we're putting forward might actually have an impact on, say, the textiles sector in Canada, and I know that the people who work in that sector tend to be women, tend to be minorities, then I have to actually demonstrate to someone and prove that I've thought about it. And I think, as much as we criticize checking boxes and, you know, forms and things like that. Actually, forms are a great motivator for us public servants. It's surprising how, like, filling out the document and knowing that I have to submit it to my boss and that they're going to look at it, it really does affect your thinking. And so I think that we've taken a big leap forward in recent years in terms of how do we integrate a broader range of perspectives into our negotiating approach. I still think that there's a way to go on that, and that, you know, we need to, sometimes you're rushed, you're preparing something on short notice, and you don't have time to really go through and think about like all of the possible ways that your decisions may affect various groups. But I think, and I'll bring it back to participation and representation, at least if you have the people in the room, then that thought, that perception is going to be considered. So I would say that both formal processes and then greater representation are the way that we can make sure that our negotiations really reflect the interests of our marginalized communities.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Delaprée. And I had no clue that there were like a systematic approach to this, like with the forms and everything. I think it has its benefits of ensuring as well that people with, I guess, diverse, like identities, different than ours, are able to account for those elements as well in their negotiations. So thank you very much for your answer. Moving on, I would go to Ambassador Blanc, if you're comfortable answering a question. I was interested in hearing you sharing insights or any experiences from your overseas postings in Africa and Southeast Asia in the past. I was wondering, how can you specifically address challenges you've encountered in addressing systemic racism and promoting diversity, and how sort of do you navigate and advocate for increased diversity within the Foreign Service?
Thank you. That is a great question. Bonne fête, Ben Marc. Tu devrais pas me prendre comme exemple. Edmond Wega was still the best, and Nadia Theodore and Elizabeth Williams. So basically, it's funny because we had our first Black ambassador in the late 90s, and then the second one was my former boss, Edmond Wega, when I was in Ghana. That was the 2016, 2017. So it took a few decades later to have the second one. And then once we started to use disaggregated data and to be intentional, and we develop a strategy, then we started to see that we have people that are competent. It's the same approach that we had in 2015 when the Prime Minister said we need representations in terms of women ambassadors. We're around 22%. And last year, 2022, we're around 49%. So to answer the second part of your question first, every effort needs to be intentional. And for that to yield results, you need to use the data, you need to develop a strategy, but also, again, allyship is key. You cannot do that alone, because if we go back to the first part of the question, in terms of challenges in addressing systemic racism, is that when we started, I was in the first anti-racism secretariat, as you mentioned, and some colleagues would be like, what are you talking about? It doesn't exist. Visible minorities are overrepresented. So then when you look at the disaggregated data, you'd be like, but most of our colleagues are, nothing wrong against that, at the junior levels. How do we get representations at all levels? Again, you have to be intentional, or you'll hear people telling you, yeah, get over it. Life is tough, move on. So it's not always an easy road. We have great leadership. Like I mentioned, the call to action from the previous clerk of the Privy Council. So again, be intentional. That's extremely important. And then in terms of resistance, there will be resistance. And if you don't have a strategy and if you don't have allies, you will fail. And not only within your own department, for example, or within your own private sector job, but also with others. We worked so closely at the time with RCC and other departments, D&D and others, to make sure that it wasn't only a gap movement. And it was easier because, again, you had the chief, the clerk, the Privy Council, the chief of all departments telling everyone it's a priority. You had the governor telling everyone it's a priority. So it was intentional. And this is where recently, I believe this week, the government announced some specific funding for Black public servants as well. So how can you do that? Well, you need the data. How do you get the data? Then again, you will face resistance. So at each step, there will be resistance. And that's normal because that's human nature. And if you get discouraged, you will fail because you have to understand human nature. Human nature favors the status quo because we know the status quo. Everything is fine. Get over it. We all face challenges. Absolutely. We all face challenges. But in addition to the normal challenges that we all face, then we go back to intersectionality. These are the additional challenges that people with different backgrounds, skin color, gender, religious beliefs, people with a handicap might face in addition to that. So then you go back to fairness. Then if you talk about fairness, then you talk about equity. Then you can bring people into that conversation of equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI. But then again, if you want these allies, you have to be able to convince people. In order to convince people, you need to educate yourself, but you need to do that homework in terms of understanding the issues at hand. It's not impossible because you're not alone. Again, these are the main challenges, but at the end of the day, you need concrete actions. And this is where when we're designing anti-racism or an EDI action plan, you need specific actions. You may go along and get to the low-hanging fruits, but one has to realize that this is a systemic problem. If you're facing a systemic problem, you need long-term enduring solutions. And unfortunately, this takes times. And at the same time, you need to show success. So this is where you go on the one hand with the low-hanging fruit. On the other hand, you need that strategies that will yield results in the mid to long term. If you want to change the system, you need systemic solutions, and these take times. A lot of people will talk about training. Training is not enough. It's been proven over and over again. You need on the good side, definitely, you need to provide people training, but you need to provide real actions. For example, if people have to go through the same model of exams in order to be promoted, you need, as was mentioned in the call to action, you need to find other ways to allow these competent people to be promoted. Everything has to be based on competency, on merit. That's a fact. You have these people that are meritorious, that have what it takes, but because there are barriers within the system, they cannot break these barriers. And again, going back to the Public Service Commission study, you'll see that the different groups, for example, may fail at different level of an interview, of a process. And this is because we're all different from different backgrounds, but these exams were made for a specific set of people. And if you don't go into that mold, if you don't fit, you will fail. It's not because you don't have the required competencies, it's not because you couldn't succeed, but it's because it was designed that way. It's a system. So you have to understand the system in itself in order to be able to bring enduring long-term solutions. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Blanc. I'm speechless. It was really interesting to hear your answer, and also it's still shocking that there's not enough data on this, and I guess it's something that we have to push further if you want to see sustainable change in the Foreign Service. So thank you very much for your answer. Lastly, I would go with Ambassador Diendéré, and I sort of want to ask a question about his past experience in social responsibility. So how do you envision leveraging your background in universal accessibility, sustainable development, and social responsibility to address the needs and aspirations of Afro-descendant communities? And are there any specific initiatives, partnerships that you plan to undertake in the African context to further these goals and contribute to the empowerment and recognition of Afro-descendants in the African Union? Whenever you're ready, Ambassador.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear us? Ambassador Diendéré, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah. Look, maybe because I'm a minority, I've been all my life a minority, coming from Burkina Faso and living in France and then in Canada. Being a minority prepared me to work on the French subject, which means every time I'm in charge of something, I'm kind of I have my own my private mandate, which is to check on the minorities and the subject that nobody wants to talk about. And it has been a long time since I'm working on accessibility. I was in the telecom business. My thinking was, my people don't have telecom, they don't have internet. How are they gonna do things? And imagine if they are impaired vision, they have deaf, they have mobility problem. How can they drive on this world where there is no place for everybody at first? So right now, I did the same thing in the train business, in the railroad. So it was shocking for me to see that if you are a minority, like you have an accessibility problem, you get in the station in Canada, you could be you could be surprised to see how unfriendly these places are for the minorities. Mobility, I'm thinking about people with handicaps, but think about people with autism, people with, let's say, impaired vision, working on La Gare Centrale in Montreal. It is a big deal. So I put myself on the line. I asked the executive director to give me this mandate to work on the accessibility plan. And we did it for VRL Canada. Look, in Africa, imagine, I'm not dealing with right now with being a minority here. I'm Black and everybody's Black around me, but I'm dealing with another stuff. It is so difficult to imagine someone with, let's say, a wheelchair getting even in Ethiopia, a Canadian embassy in Ethiopia, there is no place for them. There's no elevators. I'm like, okay, imagine one day our own senators with all these medals, I'm thinking about her with a wheelchair, want to come here and talk about accessibility. It will be difficult for her to access the embassy, the Canadian embassy. I mean, we're talking about accessibility and all this stuff here. And in Africa, it is a big deal. And because there is a cultural thing around it, you get dismissed about everything. So African Union has this plan for disabilities, and they're looking for partners to make sure that there is a kind of convention to protect all these minorities, the impaired vision, the deaf, and the sign. And last week I was on one of those technical forum, and
Oh no. He lost him. Let's give him a few seconds. Hopefully he comes back. Ambassador Diendéré, are you still here? Can you hear us? We'll give him a few more seconds, and if he can't, he left the call. Thank you for the comments in the chat. we'll be moving very soon to the Q&A period. So if you have any questions, prepare them. They'll be ready to answer. Should I move on? I guess I'll go to the last question in the meantime. If Ambassador Diendéré joins us again, we'll give him the floor to speak. It's unfortunate though, because his points were very, very interesting. In the meantime, Counsellor Delaprée and Ambassador Blanc, if you're open to answering the last question that I had for you, it would be someone join in. I don't know if it's him. Let me see. Yeah, I'll just ask the last question and we'll move on like that. So my last question that I had for you was, what sort of guidance can you provide to those who aspire to embark on similar paths in international affairs, and especially those who may encounter obstacles related to their racial, ethnic background? Whoever wants to answer first.
I'm happy to start.
Thank
happy
you.
to start. Advice. I think my first and biggest piece of advice is to encourage them to say, go for it, to really say, you know, this is a Global Affairs Canada, Canadian diplomacy. We need you. We absolutely need a diverse set of views, a set of views that reflects the reality of Canada, and you should absolutely go for it because we need you. So that would be my first thing that I would say. My advice to them would be, I'm going to echo something that I said at the start, is to have a very open mind about what it means to be a diplomat. I encourage everyone to go through kind of the traditional route and to write the tests and exams. And I hope, as Ambassador Blanc said, that we'll have a more appropriate, reflective way of evaluating people that doesn't necessarily perpetuate barriers. But, you know, go ahead, write that exam, but also look at kind of, I think we have to be much more open-minded in what diplomacy means. And like I said, I work here with colleagues from all sorts of departments who are doing different things, whether it be transport. I have colleagues from industry, health, CBSA. And so a career in diplomacy is not necessarily a career in global affairs. And I encourage you to think large and look at the breadth of opportunities that are open and available to you. And then I would say, to really start developing that network and those relationships. And it's not just about, you know, being friends with the deputy minister or having an in with a senior official. I mean, if you can do that, great, absolutely, that's wonderful. I encourage you to do that. But you will find, or I have found over the course of my career, that the most valuable relationships that I've had are, you know, my peers or someone that, you know, I worked with at a distance in one mission who's like, hey, I remember you and I would like to create, I'd like to work with you again. You know, one of the reality about working at Global Affairs Canada, it's very relationship based. But you have something special and you can create relationships with people around you, and I encourage you to do that. And that starts through, obviously, coming in at the bottom levels. Of course, if you can get a student position, that's great. If you attending events like this, I think is really great too, because you can kind of get to see and learn more about what people are doing. But I really think that kind of like building those connections with people and getting to know them is really something that's useful for overcoming obstacles. But I find sometimes, you know, when you do face an obstacle, it's great to have somebody in your workplace to turn to look to say like, hey, am I crazy? You know, actually, so I work here in the trade section at the embassy in Paris, but my counterpart in the political section is also a Black woman, a NIPSIA grad. And a number of times I've gone over to her on the second floor and said like, hey, what about this? Does this sound crazy? And so it's good to kind of have those I mean, we can't give each other promotions but it's great to have somebody to rely on and share experiences with, and you never know what it could result in the future. And then I encourage you, once you are in, to all of those networks that we've talked about, they really have some value. And remember that you have something to offer. I think so many times we kind of come in, we're like, okay, well, I'm trying to see what can I do, how can I fit in. You are bringing in something really incredible. And one of the things that I've noticed in my career is, and it's actually one of the things that makes me so proud to be a Canadian diplomat, is sometimes, you walk into the room and someone's like, oh, who's that? And like, oh, that's Canada. And just by sitting in the chair and having the little placard in front of your name that says Canada, you're saying something about the country that you represent and the values that it represents. And so I would really, and that's a great feeling, I would have to say. So I highly encourage you to pursue a career in diplomacy. It can be difficult. It can be, at times it's painful to be away from family and friends, but it's also a great adventure. And, what a privilege to be able to say that about your job and your life.
Thank you so much for leaving us on these words, Counsellor Delaprée. Ambassador Blanc, do you have anything to add to this question?
Yes, I should have gone first because Frédérique has been so positive. I will maybe discourage a few. First of all, be ready. I don't give advice. I give a few pointers, take it or leave it, whatever. But please be ready to leave your comfort zone. It's my first posting abroad in Thailand. I was meeting with high-level officials and their executive assistant. Canada? But you're looking at my skin. I'm like, I know. So you have to have a certain sense of humor. You have to understand that we're multicultural, so is the US and a few other countries, but not the whole world is like that. Even in the age of AI, social media, people are still expecting Canada to be white. Even when they see ministers that are Black or from different backgrounds, they're still expecting Canada to be white. Even here, I went to a meeting and you would have think that he saw me on the TV. I've been a few times on the TV. So because I used to be a phenomenon until my very efficient Black American colleague arrived. So more competition for Canada here. She's a Black woman. She's great at what she does, being an ambassador. So I went to the meeting with the minister. The minister said, he went to my white colleague, head of political, and they said, no, he's the ambassador. He's like, people come. Canada is a Black ambassador, come. So, and I'm like, yeah, thank you, sir. And sometimes when we go to minister's office, they tend to go to my white colleagues. And I let them go. And then I introduce myself, Anderson Blanc from the Canadian Embassy. I don't even bother to say the ambassador. Then when the minister comes in, ambassador, then they're like, oh, he's the ambassador? Yes. So it takes confidence because you need to be able to leave your comfort zone. And you need to know yourself. You need to know your values. For that to happen again, you need to develop your skills. You need to be aware of the barriers that exist. You need to develop strategies to overcome them because they're real. And you need to surround yourself with positive people who complement you. And around that, I believe that we need to be frank and honest with ourselves, and we need to be authentic. Authenticity will make people go toward you. We need to treat people with respect. And showing these values, regardless of what type of job you're aspiring to, will be extremely helpful. And it's even more helpful in the diplomatic world because people will tell you it's cutthroat, it's super hard and everything, and they're right, absolutely right. It's not easy, and please listen to what Frédérique said. She's absolutely right. You need to build these networks. You need all of the above. And you also need to allow yourself to make mistakes. I've been blessed. I've had from good to excellent managers. I've had colleagues who've had interesting managers, and it's hard. But if you have safe spaces and others to talk to, it helps a lot. So we would be lying if we'd say it's easy. It's not easy. We hope to pave the way for others, like others before us have paved the way. We're always open to supporting them. That being said, it's important to be reminded that you have your own homework to do. And it starts with, like Frédérique and Marc mentioned, what about internship? If you're so interested, have you thought about doing internship in an international organization? What is your portfolio showing? Your past experience. It's not only about getting A plus in your curriculum and then finishing with a mention. What have you done before that during your studies? Have you seek some external experience? So it's all of the above, but at the end of the day, as Marc was mentioning, if you're truly passionate about something, you'll do everything it takes to learn about that, to equip yourself. So when you get there, you're better equipped. For example, you know, we're bilingual. English is my third language. So at the end of the day, you're lucky you're in, most of us right now, you're in Ottawa, Carleton, so it's a bilingual city. So if you don't speak French, learn. I know your French is perfect, but yeah, you need to get these competencies, this skill set, learn about other cultures, go abroad, do some internships, show that you're interested in international affairs. So when I see your resume, you're not come as a student, as an intern, I'm like, you've been there, you're showing interest. Not, I'm a superb student, I have A plus everywhere, and I'm now interested for this. It's the real world and the academic world, as we all know, are two different things. Get some real life experience. I'll stop there. Sorry.
Don't
a
fall.
bit negative.
No, it's okay. You kept it real with us, and I think it's very important for the current state of affairs to know what we're bracing ourselves for. So thank you very much for closing on that. With that being said, I would open it up for questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand so we can begin the question and answer period, we will begin now. Not all at once. Oh, I see. Is that Ambassador Diendéré? Here, I just noticed. Do you want to also speak to that, the advice for the last question? You're muted. Oh. No, it's not working. It's okay. If participants want to raise their hands to ask questions or even ask them in the chat, I can ask them on your behalf. Not all at once, please. Yes, the first hand that was raised, iPhone 2.
Hi, Mo, it's me. Sorry, I don't know how to get my name to change on my iPad. Yeah. Thanks so much, Chevron, for the panel. It was so great to listen to all of you. I have a question. I'm not quite sure how to ask it, but essentially, what had happened to me earlier this month, I won't say where I work, but my supervisor of my job was talking about Black History Month and how there was an event happening, that kind of thing. And the way he had talked about it is that I could see right as he was talking about it, he almost sounded not uncomfortable, but almost like he didn't really know what he was supposed to say about it. And he did like a good job, you know, like trying to talk about the Black History Month we're having, like the event happening at our job. But the thing that he said that kind of made me not like upset, but I was just like that's not the way to go about saying it, is that he was talking about how, you know, like one of our supervisors here, one of our coworkers, she also has a Black husband. So if you wanted to like talk to her about, you know, her experience with that, but this coworker was a white lady. Do you know what I'm saying? And so when I was sitting there in that meeting, I was thinking like, oh, like, well, I appreciate that we're talking about Black History Month, like talking about like tokenizing this coworker's husband is like not the way to like talk about Black History Month. Do you know what I mean? So I was just wondering for the panelists, like when it comes to these kind of like conversations, like talking about DEI, right? Because like when we have these events, not all the time, but oftentimes the audience is almost like preaching to the choir, like it is the DEI community who comes to these events. So how do we kind of approach these conversations with white coworkers, like talking about critical concepts like these, when tokenism is something that happens a lot when it comes to DI discussions? I'm sorry if that wasn't like fully like making sense, but yeah, there's a moment in that conversation with my that I had where I was like, I don't know how to approach my supervisor, someone like in a direct higher power than me, right? To say that's just like not necessarily how we should be approaching this topic.
No, I think it was a very interesting and topical question. If any of the speakers want to answer that question first.
I can go first. Depends on the power structure, right? And if you're in the private or public sector. But if you don't feel comfortable enough to do it alone, then maybe thinking about is talking with colleagues, how they felt about it, and seeking some allyship. Obviously, not to gang up against the supervisor, but rather to find strategies. For example, if you're in the public sector, you have the Canadian school, public school, I forgot the name, the Canadian public school, they provide training, right? I say training is not everything, but trainings are good starting points, right? So if your unit or division decides, oh yeah, we need, maybe we should have this training about being Black in the public service, or EDI, intersectionality, and these things. And also, is there, again, if it's in the public, federal public service or provincial, more and more of them have EDI groups. There are resources that you should try to see. And even if you're in the private sector, there are also resources as well. The last thing I would recommend doing is going one-on-one and being confrontational. That's not the approach. Obviously, the approach is really to understand that that person is uncomfortable, and it's okay, because we've been uncomfortable enough, often, a lot, and it will continue like that. But it's important to remind ourselves that we're looking to create allyship. And in order to do that, you need to be coming from a point of understanding, especially for people in position of power that can actually change the whole dynamic, the whole work environment, if you can bring that person on board. Even when we're working on the anti-racism strategy, on an EDI strategy, not everyone will be on board. You may have 20% champions, 60% of the people on the fence, and 20% that will resist and tell you this is not needed, this is a waste of time. So how do you identify these champions, these allies, and how do you bring some of these undecided to your side, and then you create a critical mass to seek change? I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Blanc. Counsellor Delaprée, do you have anything to add to this question?
No, I think that's the perfect answer, but I would just say, those things happen, and they do happen, and they keep happening, and sometimes it's really hard to find the right answer. And I would just say to give yourself a lot of grace. Sometimes you know exactly what to do and you handle it perfectly, and other times you're like, oh, I had this awkward conversation, I don't know what to say. And just remember, like, it's not on you. You do your best. You're not there to educate everyone, and sometimes it's tiring and you're just going to let it go. And so I would just say all of the advice that Ambassador Blanc said, but also give yourself a lot of grace if those things are confusing and weird, because sometimes they just are.
Thank you very much. The second question that we got in the chat from Ebenezer is, what's a personal career highlight that you're most proud of? Would you want to? Yes.
Well, I can start. I'm hoping that my personal career highlight that I will be most proud of has yet to arrive, and I'm looking forward to seeing what it is. I think for me, this is a really early memory of my career, but I was in Washington, D.C., and we were working for Canada to be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. If you know, the CPTPP, as the agreement is known now, and it was a kind of whole, if not whole of embassy project. It was certainly a whole of trade project. And the day that we got the okay from the Americans and the other negotiating parties to come in, that was a really wonderful moment. That's not something that happens very often, actually, or in my experience, that you just have like a one moment where like, yes, we did it. Sometimes what we're doing is much more iterative and long-term process. And but that was a moment that I really remember being like, oh, okay, we did this. We moved the needle as Canadian Foreign Service officers. What a great feeling to have accomplished that. But I think more generally, I wouldn't point to one moment. I think it's, over the course of a career, every new posting is a moment of like pride. And just in now that I'm here in Paris, that I'm leading a team and managing people, that's been its own kind of special moment of pride and, becoming a leader and developing those skills. So, yeah, I think that it changes every day. And I have to say, actually, another moment is the first time I went into the WTO, and I was talking about that little Canada placard, and I sat behind with the name Canada, and I was extremely uncool, and I had like my colleague from Chile walk around and take a picture of me with my like Canada, and I spoke into the mic, and I also had her take a picture of me on the big screen, and I was being very uncool. And I don't think that I said anything of consequence that day, but it just felt really special and proud to be sitting behind the name Canada.
Thank you so much, Delaprée. And we're all proud of you for the work that you're doing. And I think it's really interesting to hear about your milestones. Do you want to answer the question, Ambassador Blanc? I'd be curious to also hear your thoughts.
Sure. I think for me as a manager is to be able to create healthy, safe working environment for everyone wherever I go. That's my prime directive. That's super important. And in addition to that, whenever colleagues, locally engaged staff, Canadians are interested in reaching the next level, to be able to support them in a successful way, because there's no better, to me, satisfaction than to see colleagues with high potential, sometimes with MBAs and positions where they cannot exploit their full potential. These two things, I think, bring me a lot of joy and happiness, because at the end of the day, I strongly believe that representing Canada, bless you, representing Canada is a privilege and an honor, and we have to show our values abroad, but also when we're abroad, we are the face of Canada more and more so, because Canada is Black, is Indian, is multicultural, is multi-religious, is diversity, is everything. So we have to be able to reflect that abroad and to show that we are about openness, inclusion, diversity, and equity. So yeah, these would be the two things that I try to create whenever I'm abroad, or in Canada for that matter.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Blanc. I see we have two hands that were raised. I think the first one by Semilore. Sorry if I mispronounced. Feel free to introduce yourself and ask your question.
That's okay. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
My name is Semilore. There's no H there, but it's pronounced with an H. Thank you all so much for being here. This has been amazing. I'm currently at work and listening in, so it's been great. But I did have a couple questions, if you could indulge me. My first one was just about the building your competencies, especially early on in your career, if you're not like I work as a government relations consultant, and like provincially and municipally most often. And so Ambassador Blanc talked about the fact of like getting international experience. Frédérique, you talked about that as well. And so wanted to ask more about practical ways to kind of garner some of those competencies, especially also if you're early career stage in a slightly different path, like it all links, but a slightly different path. My second question then is, can you also, if you don't mind sharing, give some practical examples of how you've been able to balance your professional life with your personal life? And so, for example, if you have partners or kids, like, are you picking them up every couple of years and like going with you? Do they stay in Canada? Like, how are you able to kind of practically do that, and some of the things that you do to, as you transition from place to place, kind of keep yourself sane and also be able to like learn new things, but stand your ground as well with your own values, which leads to my third question, which is about how for yourself, especially because you're representing Canada, Canada as a nation, just like with like anything else and anybody else that you have a relationship with, you might not always agree with the decisions that like the nation makes. And so on a public and a global stage, how are you able to reconcile sometimes if you don't agree with something, but your position has to represent that initiative or represent Canada in a certain way? Let me know if that makes sense and if I need to clarify, but would really appreciate your insights. And again, thank you.
Those were all very good questions, Shemilori. Counsellor Delaprée or Ambassador Blanc, go ahead.
I can talk about balancing professional and personal life. I was a little bit foolish when I started in Thailand. I got two boys there. So they have their birth certificate in Thai, MFA translated into English. So they're very proud. So the other one is a normal kid. He was born in Montreal. I was born in Haiti. So we're all special. My spouse was born in Haiti. So we're all special except for him. He was just born in Canada. When I go abroad, it's a team exercise, right? My spouse and my boys, they choose 15 places, and then amongst these, we bring these to 7 or something. And then as a family, we say like, we have a list, so you may choose 5 or 6. So it's a team exercise because it involves a lot of sacrifices. One has to recognize that and develop mechanisms and strategies to deal with them. Social media there can be positive tools, but also a lot of opportunities, discovering new countries, making new friends, new cultures, new food. So you have to be able to see the excellent, very good part, but realize that not only ourselves, but also the whole family may face some issues. If you think about the kids losing some friends, then you get to WhatsApp or Discord they use nowadays, or Roblox, they play together with their friends in Ottawa and elsewhere around the globe. So you have to be able to balance everything, but they have to be involved in terms of balancing. I think that's key. And again, using all these tools that some of them we rediscovered during COVID allows us to be connected with family and everything, but it has, in its foundation, it has to be a family decision. I strongly believe in that. In terms of building your competencies, there are federal programs. I visit a university here every month or two, an education institution, and I tell those students the same thing. It's about it, not only se former et s'informer, they're getting a great education, but sometimes I have to tell them about the Ivorian government youth programs. That's kind of weird. They're like 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 25 years old, and I'm the Canadian. I have to tell them about the program of the Ivorian government. I'm like, you have to do your own homework. So there are a couple of programs in place on the federal government and the provincial governments as well, where you get international experience, youth programs, young adults. So I think you can take advantage of that. Or even if you go to an NGO and said, I'm trying to develop these international competencies. I could go as a volunteer abroad if you want me to. I could work. And they'll tell you about these programs, or they'll say yes, and facilitate some of these things for you. In terms of the last questions with, that's a good one, not agreeing with the Canadian government position. It hasn't happened to me so far because with Côte d'Ivoire, I was going to say Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, Côte d'Ivoire has been supporting us very much in terms of our positions as well. And the positions we've been taking are based on our values. And our values in general, like I said, we saw what the clerk of the Privy Council put forward in terms of the call to action. We saw gender equality. That's top of mind here. And we've been recognized as a champion. Even the UN Women gave us the champion he for she. At the same time with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Côte d'Ivoire. So far, so good. I'm on a great market so far. In terms of other countries, when I was in Ghana, now just legislation I was reading in terms of the LGBTQ2+ community, it's getting harder. So it's the other way around in terms of inclusion for us Canadians when you're looking at saying, oh, everyone deserves to choose. Everyone deserves to be able to be their own self. And then at the end of the day, there may be challenges in certain countries. That's our diplomats. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to reconcile our own values with the values that we're defending because we are the face of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Counsellor Delaprée.
Well, yeah, not much to add to such a full response to the question. Maybe I'll add two things. I mean, I'm like Ambassador Blanc. I'm very lucky in my career that I haven't had to really be called on to defend a decision that I thought was morally wrong or was in harsh contradiction to my values. Do I agree with everything that I have to put forward? But no, but I'm comfortable that I'm representing Canada and not like the Republic of Frédérique, as much as I would like to do that. I think going back to one of the topics that we've spoken to today, when I was in Geneva and working around the UN organizations, we meet in regional groups, but really it's like Western countries, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And, one of the big fault lines in Geneva is between developing countries and developed countries and how we have very different, visions of how certain organizations or certain resolutions should be going forward or what policies should be decided on. And I always found it very difficult, even though it wasn't like against my values, to be, the only Black person in a room full of other Western countries of people saying like, oh, the African group has got it all wrong, or, the Caribbean group has got it all wrong, and we need to, say something different, even though it's very legitimately in line with Canadian interests. That's a really weird feeling to be in that room. And so it can be difficult. Ways to resolve or kind of face that cognitive dissonance, I found is, since I'm in the room, I can kind of bring something and contribute something to the discussion that maybe someone else here can't, and really share that vision and share that value. I grew up in a Haitian family, and I have a particular vision and values that I can put forward in the discussion and maybe move the needle. And then also that maybe it can be easier in the multilateral sphere to have discussions with people outside your group, because you can say like, actually we have this in common, and maybe you can help bring the groups together. But certainly that happens. I think you do have to make peace with the fact that it's not always going to be something that you agree with before you even start the job. But I've been really lucky, and I think many Canadian diplomats have been, that they haven't been called on to do that. But I know that that's not the case for everyone. And then on the other two questions, building competencies, totally agree with what Ambassador Blanc said. And remember, like, international competencies aren't just developed internationally. I had never worked internationally when I started at the foreign service, but I work in government and other places. And so, don't think that you have to do that. It can be helpful, but you can show that interest in other ways. And then work-life balance, I kind of have the opposite family situation of the ambassador, and then I'm single, so it's very easy to kind of move around and make decisions. But it's also very challenging because you're by yourself in a new country and you have like no network and no people that you know, so it can be very difficult in that way. And so again, going back to the importance of developing those networks of people that you can rely on. I think whether you are coming with a whole brood of people or by yourself, it's really important to make those links with other people who are in your situation.
Amazing responses. Thank you to the both of you, and I hope it answered your questions, Shimilori. Herman had a question next, and then we'll have one last question, and then we'll close. We had quite a few questions, and I want to address a few of them. So, Herman, if you're still here and you want to ask your question, feel free to do so.
Yeah, thank you all for the informative session. My question is more so, not to be a Debbie Downer, but did you ever have any moments where like second thoughts of your like career that you are in right now, and any like point in time where you ever felt like giving up, especially as often being, one of the few Black people or even the only Black person in the room? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I can start. It's a fantastic job. I have the trade background. I did the political background. I did some development job. I did what we call the corporate at HQ as well. So it's this kind of job that you can do. And I also did, when I started my career, I went to the WTO and had some fun negotiating with my colleagues with China and Vietnam and Kazakhstan. So it's so diverse. You have so many options. It's really great in that regard. This is the cherry on the ice cream, really, in that regard. Other than that, no, never had any doubts. So will I be doing that my whole life with the few years that I have left? Okay, maybe not a few. I don't know. I'm always looking for new opportunities, new things. So they say we usually change jobs every 3 or 4 times in our lifetime. I've changed jobs, I don't know, 10 times already. So in the same department. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, I have to say, yes, I have had my doubts. It's a long road, it's a long career, and you have some very high highs, and sometimes it can be, I've been in situations where I'm like, oh, I feel kind of marginalized, or my ideas aren't being listened to, and is this really, because you make a lot of sacrifices in just this job, you're away from the people yes, it's great, and you discover new things as well, but when things are going not as well, then you're like, oh, well, maybe I should be back home. But the great thing about global affairs is exactly what the ambassador said, which is that you know that it's not an eternal thing. And I find sometimes you're like, well, this is kind of challenging, but I know that in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, I'm going to have a new opportunity and something different. And I've never had 2 experiences in a row where I found things difficult. And I must say, usually times where I've been more kind of ambivalent, or when you just arrive somewhere and you don't really know people and you don't really have the lay of the land. And I find once you have like a few colleagues or a few counterparts from other countries to really kind of bounce ideas against, or to say like, what about the situation? It really makes, it can make the situation much more enjoyable and exciting. But I think, yes, I have doubts, but this job in so many ways has been so great that it really has outweighed those doubts. But yes, I think that it's, normal to have that questioning and to have those difficult moments, but the good by far outweighs the bad.
Thank you very much. Herman, I hope that answered your question. We have one last question. We got more, but we're running out of time and we're late. So I'll make it very brief, but I received a question sort of like along the lines of the previous questions, but the person studies in a different field, specifically environmental education communications. And they were sort of wondering if there have been moments where specialized assets were encouraged in the Foreign Service, specifically as they have experience or studying in a program that's outside of international affairs.
Well, I'll speak from my memory, and maybe the ambassador is more informed than I am. You know, there were times in the past where I remember they said, oh, well, it would be useful to have a legal background or to have a master's degree or to speak these specific languages. But actually, I think kind of the allure and the advantage of the Foreign Service recruitment process, of the kind of traditional Foreign Service recruitment process, is that, and it can change from year to year, so you know, take this with a grain of salt, but oftentimes the only requirement was that you have a bachelor's degree in any subject. And so wherever you were coming from, whether you had studied, you know, Sanskrit or math or engineering or kinesiology, there was a door open for you into the Canadian Foreign Service. So, and I think that's something, you know, again, you've got to, I recommend that you look at jobs.gc.ca and keep an eye out for the announcements of competitions that have been coming out more regularly now. But certainly when I was joining the Foreign Service, it was open to everyone, and I thought that that was really one of the very positive things about the organization. There are people I work with, yeah, who have all sorts of backgrounds and studies, and I think that makes them especially valuable. That it's, I mean, I have a degree in history and law, and that's like maybe more of a traditional path for diplomats, but I think it's great to have people coming in from different areas and contributing in that way.
Ambassador Blanc seems to echo what you said, if I'm not mistaken.
The only thing I would add is, like my colleague Marc, is there are a lot of entries as well, right? Sometimes they call you, but sometimes you can also knock at the door, and it's an opportunity as well. People with different skill sets that may enter instead of being career diplomats like Frédérique and myself.
Yeah, and to build on that, to answer the person's question, Ambassador Diendéré is like the perfect example to answer that question, with extensive experience specifically in communications and working in the private sector for so many years. You can really look up to him to see that you don't have to follow that traditional path in international affairs and diplomacy to make it into the field. And with that, I would like to close the session. So I would like to express my deepest gratitude for our speakers, Ambassador Anderson Blanc, Counsellor Frédérique Delaprée, as well as Ambassador Marc Diendéré, who had issues at the end with his connection, he said, but he's thanking everyone for this conversation and is really hopeful that we'll have another opportunity to chat. But your wisdom and challenges and triumphs within the Foreign Service were really insightful for all of us. And to our audience, I want to also thank you for your active participation and engagement. Your questions have contributed to the depth of this conversation. So once again, thank you all for your participation. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful day and evening for Counsellor Delaprée and Ambassador Blanc. Thank you so much, everyone.